really does bring back memories of my young childhood days, because every day we can hear the whistle, the train locomotive whistle. Whenever they cross a crossing, they always blow the whistle, and the clanging of the bells, to warn of traffic. And then the brakeman will run ahead, and then see the road is clear. But the whistle will, every crossing we can hear the whistle blowing.
And there would be 2 empty cane cars behind the hedge, behind the garden. And us kids found out that if you pulled a pin and you released the brake, and it was downhill from Koloa School to Kukui'ula, that the car would roll all the way down to Kukui'ula. We probably were going 20 miles an hour or more, we don't know. And when we got down to the bottom, the railroad tracks curved and started back up a hill. And it was to scrub the speed off, and we'd get off. And then maybe a few days later, we take the other one. And then Mr. Sanderson, who was the manager of McBride, would have to call up my father, who was the manager of Koloa, and tell him to come and get his 2 cane cars that were on McBride track. And it wasn't until I was about 19 that I had the guts to tell my father that I was one of the kids who was stealing the cane cars.
I grew up in the Lihue Plantation area, the Hanumalo section. I lived about 25 yards away from the roundhouse. And by every roundhouse, there was a big sand pile. And youngsters used to gather there and play in the sand. And while the night wiper would be cleaning down his engine, he would have to change the location of the locomotive just before he goes home. So all the youngsters had a chance to ride the train. And some of us were fortunate enough to learn how to use or manipulate some of the levers and move the train. It was fun, and I guess everybody wanted to be a locomotive engineer at that time.
Locomotives began to be used for harvesting on Grove Farm in 1895 and went until they actually began to go out of locomotive use as early as 1954 on Grove Farm in the Koloa section of Grove Farm, what was Koloa Plantation. And it wasn't until 1957 that that was the last year of harvesting using locomotives.
Kauai's Grove Farm Museum has 4 locomotives that once hauled cane for the island's sugar industry. Railroad men speak the names of these amazing machines: Paulo, Wainiha, Kaipu, and Wahiawa, with a kind of reverence usually reserved for living beings. Loving care and substantial funds have restored 3 engines to operational splendor. Alicio Antonio was Grove Farm Plantation's last steam locomotive engineer. At age 77, he assists the museum with restoration and educational programs. He joined the plantation workforce in 1928 and became a brakeman in 1941.
Put the brake on a train, on a car. Put about 10 brake. Then you can control up go down the mill. This train here, you can control up with the wall of the brake because he pushing it. He go down the grade, he go push. And then when you go up the hill, you gotta have all the brake again. When you go down, you can feel you can feel the car as you go, if you go fast. If the good weather, we can pull up about 60 cars, But if bad weather, rain, we go only 40 cars, or 40 or 50 cars, because the dancing one goes only sliding on the rails. That's why you gotta put sand.
Ernest Rosa spent more than 6 years as a locomotive engineer. He remembers his early days working on the railroad.
I worked as a fireman for 3 months on locomotive number 1. At that time, they had 2 locomotives. No, 3 locomotives at that time. 1, 2, and 3. This was one of them. And because I learned how to be a fireman, and they needed a locomotive engineer, so I went on locomotive number 3. The first day that I was an engineer, I had 2 of my brakemen playing in the back of the locomotive, and one of them slipped on a running board. He fell down, and I almost ran him over.
The engine lighter came to work at 3 a.m. He lit the fires and had steam up to 150 pounds when the engineer, his firemen, and 2 brakemen began their day at 5:30.
I had to take care of my crew, be sure that they don't get hurt, and be sure to bring my empty cars to the field. Well, my job was bring the empty cars to the field and bring the cane to the mill. That was my job. And I had to do all the planning. And pull the throttle.
There was a lot more to it than just pulling the throttle. Steam engines need constant attention to things like water levels and steam pressure, as well as preventive maintenance.
Like the engineer, if the locomotive would be pulling and you'd hear a little sound, you'd come here and check on this here, the bearings. See? You'd slack your bolt and hit the pin a little further down, and all you do, just check this here. See?
And then if it'll be all right.
It'll be all right. And this is all grease here. There's no oil in here now. Not like the other ones. The other ones you put oil.
Yeah.
The oil goes in here, on your rocker arm here. This here, you call this the rocker arm. A little bit oil here. This is your rocker arms too, your springs here.
Where else would you put oil?
On your general box here. Right in there.
Well, that's where they would get real hot sometimes.
Uh-huh. This bearing here would get hot.
So if there was too little oil, what? It was smoke or what?
Well, if it'll get too hot, it'll smoke.
Engineers were responsible for lives and safety. Moving 25 tons of locomotive and 40 cars filled with cane required vigilance.
You gotta watch behind and in front too. You can just sleep close your eye inside there. You gotta look when you come down. You gotta look what happened. It might be the car still like this, and you gotta go slow like.
While walking along the track line, sometimes these locomotives will pass, and then these engineers would try to hammer us and open the steam, the blowout steam, to scare us. So, okay, we know what you're doing, okay. So on his way back, we have something fixed up for him. And that would be a thin layer of grease on the incline, see? It's invisible because with the hot sun, we put a thin layer that would melt, but yet it's all slick on the track. When it comes to that, then it starts slipping, so they shut down right there. Then we'll be watching from the side, you know, from the bushes, and we'll be laughing at them, you know. But we can hear them cussing and whatnot, but...
The train would just slip on a track because I had a sand dome. I have 2 sand domes on the locomotive. When I see the grease on the track there, I would open my sand dome. And if you have sand, well, not too bad, see. I used to carry a cane knife in the cab there. When I would see the kids on a railroad track, I show them the cane knife. They would just run for their lives, like how I used to do when I was a kid.
Increased responsibility meant more pay than other plantation jobs, and working with steam equipment had some unique fringe benefits.
Oh, boy. You see that steam chest over there?
Yeah.
If we had something with gravy on it, we'd take our lunch tin, the top of the lunch tin, and put it in there. By the time we get to the next station, our food would be hot.
You can cook potato inside, yes.
And
You can
if,
cook potato.
and if I knew, because I knew if I would work overtime or anything else, in Lihue they had a store there at one time. I would go around, 10 cents, 5 cents, we'd buy a bread or a can of corned beef or 2 cans of sausage. Wash your lunch tin, the top of the lunch tin,
Put 'em out there.
put the corned beef in there. By the time we get to the next station, we had our corned beef warm, eat our bread and our corned beef, and we could stay maybe till about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. That was our dinner. We enjoyed everything.
Yeah.
Paulo looks like a toy, but was a little engine that could pull 10 tons of cane.
Paulo was a locomotive that belonged to Koloa Plantation and built in 1887 in Germany. And it continued in use until the 1920s on Koloa Plantation. In 1948, Grove Farm Company purchased Koloa Plantation and added it to the Grove Farm Plantation. And so in acquiring Koloa Plantation, they also acquired their equipment. And Paulo was one of the pieces of plantation equipment still in Koloa.
Alicio Antonio is not a wealthy man, but his memories and shared experience represent a legacy to future generations.
As curator here, my main interest is to see that the locomotives are preserved and protected. And that, in my mind, comes first, and then secondly, that they are available for education. I think it's our hope that kids have a sense of the scale of the sound of the locomotive and of the smell of the whole workshop area. That roundhouse area certainly has a definite smell, a machinery smell, and just having a sense. It's impossible to demonstrate completely how locomotives were used in the actual harvesting of cane, but to have a sense of the steam equipment and how it was used on the plantation.
When I see these kids every month coming, the preschool kids and maybe first, second graders coming over here riding these locomotives, they don't know anything about it. But I would think that looking at these locomotives, they would go home, talk to their parents, and maybe the parents have to answer that now. Then the parents themselves, they're young, they wouldn't know anything about a locomotive, so maybe they have to go to the museum or the library to look up. Then it's very I would think it's very educational, Maybe some of the grandparents remember these things, locomotives, then they can educate the grandchildren.
Well, like how I say, they have trucks nowadays, and they only keep the locomotives for memories, that's all. That's all.
The Fukushima group, got together once a year. They hired the Oahu railway train and the passenger trains. I think there were about 5 or 6 of them. And for us, we never see the beach except that once a year. So, before 2 weeks prior to that, I couldn't sleep every night just thinking that we're going to see the great big ocean. It was really exciting. I would stay awake nights thinking about the fun that we're going to have. And so, for us, even to ride the train was exciting because nobody owned cars in those days. So we used to go down to the depot, the Waipahu railroad depot, and from there we would board the train. This entire area was all rice paddies, the Pang family.
Research for a book on plantation clothing brought Barbara Kawakami back to the scene of her childhood near the Oahu Sugar Company mill in Waipahu. It was a settlement for Japanese immigrant sugar workers. Their company-owned community was designated Camp 1. Like Barbara's home, much of the village is gone, but part survives, a tiny place where time stood still and glimpses of a bygone era remain. But change is on the horizon, and soon it will all be memory. Nobuichi Higaki was 16 when he arrived in Hawaii in 1913. We visit him as he prepares to move from the home he built as a young man.
My father was a carpenter, so when I first came here, I became a carpenter right away at 16 years old. I did carpentry work for 2 years. Then I worked in the sugarcane fields for 3 years. After that, I quit and went back to carpenter work again.
For 3 years, sugarcane field work.
So until I retired, I worked in the carpenter shop.
I went back to carpenter work.
When this house was built in 1923, it was just 17 years after I came to Hawaii. We built this house for $125. Each house cost that much. We built 7 houses.
Just down the street from Mr. Higaki lives Kimiko Yahiro. She was only 21 when she moved to this house as a bride in October of 1926. In this age of self-indulgence, her lifestyle is a refreshing reminder that one can live well without modern convenience. The furo is still prepared for bathing each day. And we are told that rice cooked in the old way tastes better.
When I first received this, I was 3 years old. My aunt had a dye shop and she bought this from the store. It's called Hakata Shibori.
Shibori means to tie-dye.
You see, it is about this high and this wide. And on the top, there is a key-like thing. Then the cloth is placed over the fork and tightly wrapped around. When it's ready to be dyed, they take it to the dye shop. It's already drawn, and that's when the tying is done. I had made into a kimono when I was in Japan. When I worked for the Howley family, I used to wear this. Yeah, I wash it many times. I think it's very wasteful nowadays. They take good care of old things. Today, young people are different.
Oba-san, how did you make the raincoat? Where did you purchase the fabric?
At Arakawa's, I never use a pattern. More or less, I use my eyes to measure the size. No tape measure needed. I sew the outside first, then put the astringent juice of the persimmon. Then, when it dries, I rub in the linseed oil. Then, when it dries, I put the other part and the lining and stitch it together. The oil is already applied before, so after it dries, I apply oil one more time. On rainy days, they wore this.
There are a lot of kiawe trees here. When I was a kid, the banana patches are still there, but usually kiawe trees all over, you know. Imagine to think that this was all rice paddy, completely, you know, way down to the Dipper Road. This is where we used to walk down, you know, and from Camp 1, and there was a wooden bridge here, very high bridge that we had to walk through in order to go to the elementary school. Underneath that bridge, the plantation train, you know, the railroad track used to run through underneath the wooden bridge. So many times, you know, we used to look down, and when the train passed by, you know, it used to be exciting for us kids. By then, see, my father was gone, and my mother had to assume full responsibility. She was a mother and father to us, you know, both, and so she was really strict with us. Especially everything we did, she would say, oh, because you don't have a father, you know, people are going to point fingers at you, so you have to be extra good. Well, the first day of class, she took me to Augustine School. She was busy with laundry. She had to put everything aside, you know. And the night before, she stayed up late to sew me that lavender Indian headdress. which I still remember. And so when we reached school, she didn't know which class I belonged to, and she couldn't speak a word of English. So she poked her head from one classroom into another. And finally, in I think the third classroom, that the lady said, oh, she probably belongs here. So I happily sat in the front row. And when class started, here comes this big woman, you know, with gray, wiry hair, and her eyes were blue. And gosh, she towered over me, and she stooped over. She must have asked me, what is your name, little girl, or something to that effect, you know. And I thought she was going to devour me because I'd never seen a Caucasian before. And I said, obake, obake, and I just ran out into the veranda, and I hung on, you know, grabbed the pillow, you know, I just clung onto the pillow outside. And the more I cried, the more she tried to comfort me because she didn't understand why I was crying. Mrs. Ueno was my next door neighbor. I always remembered her, you know, as a kindly lady. And she had lots of children too, and she really worked hard too. And Mrs. Yoshida was my neighbor in the backside. And Mrs. Endo lived a further few blocks up. Everybody really had a close relationship. You know, it was sort of a social network that I think because people lived so far away from their own, you know, native, you know, village from Japan, that they had to depend on each other. So it was wonderful.
She was early, so she remembers.
Barbara's research brings together 4 women who worked side by side in the cane fields almost a lifetime ago.
Happaiko?
That's happaiko.
This was taken later because the workers aren't carrying the cane.
I did everything from hanawai, water cane, cut cane, pula pula, cane seed, happaiko, carrot cane.
Bento was junk okazu in the olden days. Nowadays, everybody eats well. But in those days, the pay was so cheap, we had junk food. Every Monday, we made it a point of bringing beans to work for good health. Everybody spread the bento, and there were all kinds of beans.
What kinds of beans?
Red beans. They still have it now.
How were they prepared?
Sugar and salt.
No shoyu? Did the beans taste good?
We were so hungry, anything tasted good.
How long did they get for cacao? How long?
I think 11 a.m. was our cacao time.
Yeah, I think it was about 11 a.m.
How much time did you have?
Half an hour to rest.
Then you didn't have much time to rest.
No more time to rest. We had to rush and eat lunch.
The whistle goes brrr. Then everybody says, cow, cow, and rush to get their bento. Then, when the whistle goes brrr, again we say, hurry up and run.
While eating, we talk story. That was the best time.
One lady who worked with me had a hoe thrown at her by the Luna. I can still see it before my eyes. The woman was new and did not do her work right. The Luna got angry and boom, he threw her hoe away in the distance.
You worked 10 hours a day. 1 month pay was $15. You worked 26 days. Then you get that much pay. So, if you don't work the full 26 days, your pay was deducted.
A so-called bonus was part of regular pay. It meant that many would work even when sick. Mrs. Yoshida remembers a song taught to workers by the Luna, or foreman, about the bonus.
朝の3時半にここに起きてルナの命令であの汽車に乗りよいしょごへごへでやっこらかち暮らすよ休めばまたボナスがのもになるちょいちょいってそう
Small pay, harsh conditions, and the bonus system led to a strike in 1920. Vivid memories of hardship, evictions from homes, and marching together remain.
From Arakawa's, we marched down on Depot Road. Then we went to Honolulu. We held banners and marched through the streets. And we heard the Haole women watching on the roadside with tears in their eyes. Some people were laughing because a banner showed how much we're getting paid. Even some Japanese were laughing to read how little we're being paid. Some Haole women were crying when they read the words on the banner. Imagine we dressed like this and marched in Honolulu. This kind of outfits, and we marched in the strike.
Work costumes varied from plantation to plantation. Yasu Sato and Haru Ueno posed with a friend to show off the Waipahu style in workwear.
This is me.
This is me. I'm on the other end.
Protective clothing was necessary, and just getting dressed for work was a chore.
I wore the shirt. The underpants came down to the knees. Then I wear the kyahang, leggings. Otherwise, the centipedes crawl up while you're working. Then I wear the tabi. That has 3 buttons on each side. The leggings have 5 buttons. Then I have to put on my tesashi, arm guard. So altogether, 10 buttons. That's humbug.
We had a large family, and my mother was constantly busy with laundry. So she would iron all night the laundry that she did early in the morning. And sometimes I would fall asleep beside her, on the straw matting. And I would get up middle of the night and see her crying. No matter how tough it was, she never showed her tears in front of children.